All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the December 1st meeting of the South Carolina Retirement System Investment Commission. I'd like to call this meeting to order, and the first thing up is the agenda that has been proposed. I think we need a motion to adopt it. Can I have one, please?
So moved.
I have a motion. Can I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on adopting the proposed agenda? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? We have an agenda. All right, next. The minutes from the September 8th meeting were published, and I hope all of you have had a chance to review them. Are there any edits or corrections or comments to the minutes that were posted from the September 8th, 2022 meeting? None. All of those in favor of accepting these minutes as posted, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, the ayes have it. All right, folks, next up on our agenda is we have to elect a chair and a vice chair for the commission. I'll open the floor for nominations of the chair position now.
I move that Bill remain chair if he's willing to do it and eligible to do so.
Second.
I can answer the eligible question. I can't answer the willing question.
Congratulations.
Any discussion or objection? And if it's the will of the commission, then I accept. I'll now entertain motions from the commission for a vice chair. I've been told that Missy has an interest in serving as vice chair, and it's the first of the quote-unquote new round of commissioners, and so it would make sense from a continuity standpoint, but the floor is open.
You want a motion for Missy?
I'm going to let anybody make any motion they want to for anybody they see.
I'll make that motion.
Motion for Missy.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Then Missy, if you are willing, congratulations, you're now the vice chair.
Thank you.
All right. All right.
Congratulations.
The next order of business we have is commissioner committee selection. And what you see in front of you is the proposed lineup for the two different committees we have. These are the two main committees that serve under the commission. They're from time to time, they're ad hoc committees when special projects arise and things of that sort. But what you see is the recommendation for the committees for audit and enterprise risk management, and then human resources and compensation. If you all reviewed this, I'll call for a motion.
I'll make that motion.
I have a motion to approve this from Ed. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Do we have any discussion on these proposed committee members? No discussion. I'll call the vote. All in favor of these selections for committee memberships, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Anyone in objection, please say no. The ayes have it, and congratulations, new committee members. All right, should we, it's not in here, and I don't know if you and I discussed it or not, Mike, should we nominate chairs of those committees?
According to the governor's policy, Mr. Chairman, those committees themselves select the chairs. So,
All right, we'll let them do the committee work of the committees, okay?
Yeah, they'll be able to do that.
All right.
And good segue, Mr. Chair, into committee reports. Audit Enterprise Risk Management Committee is meeting next week, so it's my understanding that they haven't met in the interim between meetings, so there's not a report from that committee. The Human Resources and Compensation Committee did meet a couple of weeks ago, and really for two purposes. One, to discuss staff changes since the last time the committee was together, and then to conduct the initial round of my performance review, which was done in executive session. and there was some other information regarding personnel matters that were discussed in executive session. So I would submit that that could potentially stand for the report if you're okay with that.
Well, I'd like to add that in executive session, if any discussion is needed or wanted among the commission, we can revisit this since it involves personnel and performance reviews and so forth.
Yes, sir, and that is on the executive session, one of the reasons for going into executive session, so.
All right. So we're through that, and we'll recognize you, Mr. Hitchcock, for the CEO's report.
Mr. Chair, I don't believe that I have anything of interest for the commission, so I will, in the interest of time, I will pass it on if we want to move to the next item on the agenda, which is the Funston report.
Yes, very good. Our friends from Funston, you're now recognized, and please do your thing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's great to be back here. Oh, let me just call that great. Thank you. So just to remind you all that we were selected by the Office of the State Auditor to conduct this 2022 fiduciary performance audit. I want to thank the State Auditor for his confidence in us. And for those of you who have been here for a number of years, you may recall that we also conducted fiduciary performance audits in 2014 and 2018. And initially for the Inspector General and subsequently for the State Auditor. And we have to just say at this point, we've seen tremendous progress here. It's really been gratifying to see the progress that the organization and the Commission has made. We began our work in May of this year, and the team that we had was substantially the same as last time. I'm Randy Miller, to introduce myself to those that I haven't met. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Funston Advisory Services, and was the project manager on this. Rick Funston, our CEO, was the overall project leader. As the last review, Keith Johnson was our legal counsel. John Lukomnik was involved from an investment policy standpoint. And we had two new members, very experienced consultants as well. Mike Gold, who is not here, who has worked with us for the last 5 or 6 years, who had a long history running investment operations for TIAA-CREF. And then Steve Case, who you'll hear from momentarily, who has a distinguished career as an investment consultant, has been working with us for the last couple of years, and Steve's going to opine on some of the investment-related things you ask us to look at. So what you ask us, or what the state auditor asked us to do, had 4 objectives. The first was to take a look at the recommendations from 4 years ago and assess the level of and effectiveness of implementation, recognizing you've made some substantial changes in terms of the asset allocation, the co-investment program, the delegation policy, and so forth. So we've done that. We'll talk about that in a moment. Also, we were asked to opine on the changes that you've made to investment policies and practices and so forth in light of all those decisions that the Commission made, and we'll give you our feedback on that as well. We were also asked to evaluate the role of you as a Commission and the recognizing that there's been a big change since you delegated significant investment decision-making authority to staff. And so we have some recommendations and findings and recommendations in that area as well. And then in fourth, in general, just other recommendations that came to our attention based upon what we see as leading practices is at other funds that we work with. So in the first topic of how did you do in terms of the implementation of recommendations from the 2018 review, as I mentioned, again, we saw major progress from 2014 to 2018, a very, very different investment commission in those 4 years. The recommendations in 2018, we kind of viewed as further refinements, that they weren't as major change as the first time. And what we've seen is that The majority of the recommendations from 4 years ago were implemented. There were a number, as you had, as kind of was implied in the RFP, that were no longer valid, and we identified 9 of them that didn't really fit the current situation, and mostly related to, for example, we made some recommendations around broker-dealers, fixed income trading, transition management, and IT implementation that was based upon the assumptions that you had at that time. Those have all changed, so those recommendations really weren't valid. We also assessed 9 other recommendations as partially implemented, and then 10 that were valid, but we believe anyway, and that were not acted upon. And those we have reiterated in this review, and so we'll talk about those. And I'm just going to turn it over to Steve to talk about the second topic, which is the effect of the investment strategy changes.
Sure, thanks, Randy. And thank you for having me. One of the biggest changes that took place from our review 4 years ago to now was the simplification, but sophistication, with greater sophistication of the asset allocation policy. You went from 18 asset classes down to a very limited number, 6 asset classes that gave more flexibility in the implementation to staff rather than prescribed roles from the asset allocation studies. And this was a great change, and it added flexibility for staff as well as some creativity elements. The co-investment program from the last investment, the fiduciary review to now, was also really ramped up and has been a major improvement in your ability to add value in the alternatives area with opportunistic implementation. And the way that you've implemented that program is seen as best in class by the investment community that you're working with and from our review among peers. Certainly some updating of the internal decision-making was what happened given the changes in asset allocation policies and the implementation of the delegation of authority to staff. We spent a lot of time talking about and reviewing the internal investment committee charter, and we feel like that clearly lays out all the governance processes surrounding the target asset allocation and is very well done. And in prevailing practices in our terms with other large state pensions. One of the things that we really applaud you on is the ability to almost create a hybrid approach of using in-house staff where appropriate and using external resources and outsourcing where appropriate. We feel like you've gotten that magic balance that is so difficult to find, and we've seen that difficulty among other state pensions. So these were our key findings. In terms of,
I got it.
you got it? Oh, you got it, sorry. There is appropriate transparency from our perspective, what the staff is doing to the commission level. And that's another magic balance of too much or too little. And we feel like you've gotten that balance down right. Where we've had some findings was in the area of information flow to the commission. And we feel like this is an area that's there for improvement. Certainly the risk management program was really revamped from a VARA-based program to kind of a use of 3 major vendors and in-house developed tools. And getting that risk management information flow to the commission is something that we think you've made a lot of progress, but there's still some work to be done. The staff monitoring by the commission is another area of findings that we feel like could be improved. We're coming in from the outside, but from our perspective, the biggest risks you have come in staffing and training and development and potential turnover of staff. And we feel like the board and the commission should and could be more involved there.
Steve, can I ask a question?
Sure.
About that? Because I think you hit on a very important point. You know, do you, it kind of recognizing the, us trying to balance the limited internal resources versus external resources, do you think, the reliance on, for instance, like with Alhorn as an extension of staff,
Yes.
we kind of see that as the ability to maintain some continuity. Is that something that you see other plans doing, or, are we kind of unique in that regard, or,
I'll just say I see other plans trying to do it,
Okay.
and you've done it very, very well. Allhorn's relationship certainly is one that's grown tremendously, and you've used their talents and skills and frankly pushed them in some areas too in a very effective manner. And your culture, somehow you've got it right in terms of working with external parties. This is our last comment.
Hold on, Steve.
That the risk is mitigated because of the use of third parties, and I'm so sorry, Mr. Hancock.
You're telling us as a commission that we need to be more involved in staff monitoring. How about give me an example? Because I think, at least I feel like I'm pretty bound to the process of the commission hires a CEO and everybody else works for him.
Right.
I'm not sure that I, for one, as a commissioner, I don't have the training or the expertise to monitor the staff that works here. I don't know about the rest of my commissioners, but I don't. So give me an example of what I should, as a commissioner, be doing to monitor our staff people.
Sure.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chair, I think the answer is more, not that, we're not recommending that the commission really try to be hands-on involved in succession planning or the day-to-day staff decisions. But I think what you can do, you could get an annual report, for example, from the CEO on where do we stand, where are our open positions, how long have they been open, what do we see in the next year as our major challenges in terms of staffing, if we have any, how are we utilizing the intern program to develop bench strength. There are a lot of really good things happening. I don't think we want to blow this out of proportion, that this is a problem, but with most systems we work with, it's one of the biggest risks, if not the biggest risk, because it's very difficult to attract and develop and retain staff in the public retirement system environment for a variety of reasons. And I think we're just saying, the commission should be aware that it's a risk, should be asking for a status of just what are you doing? Are these being effective? Is there anything we can be doing from a policy standpoint that would help you? And that's more that tenor, I think, is what we're suggesting.
I'm relatively new to the HR committee, and so I might not have the full flavor, and certainly we want to support our professional staff and with respect to policy that gives them the right framework. But as far as status updates and open positions, development of staff, at least the several committee meetings I have attended since joining that team, that has been the centerpiece of conversation for the entire meeting. And I was pleased. Had it not been, I would have been very interested in those things. But just for the benefit of the commissioners who don't participate on that committee, I thought it might be helpful to know that there is a great deal of conversation around those very topics.
Yeah, we receive a detailed organizational chart at every single Human Resources and Compensation Committee meeting. I didn't know if you were aware of that, and we do, and that does have illustrations of open positions, and we get an update on the intern program where it turns into the junior analyst and then the upward trajectory of the potential folks there. So I don't know if you guys caught that in what you were rounding up or not, but I feel like Missy said, we get and see a lot of that.
Right, okay.
Well, and I can tell you, one of the things that I'm working on is kind of updating the way that the commission, working with the commission to update the way that they evaluate me, and really developing KPIs around, it really is a proxy for the organization, right? Because I think that in doing that, given that I'm ultimately responsible for the staff, that'll give them a very good look and a deeper dive into how we're managing, me and my leadership team are managing the organization. And, so that's something that I'm gonna talk to you guys a little bit later about, in the meeting.
So something that I thought was very useful and was very helpful years ago, we had, when I was chairman and we had vice chairman, as we had the chairman and the vice chairman sit down with a 10 or a 15-minute visit with every member of the staff, discussing who they are, what they do, and what they had any thoughts in terms of helping to make the organization function better. And we found that to be very useful. We got a lot of good information. It also enhanced our relationships with individual staff so that we got to know them rather than just to get a one-time, every 6 months or a year report from somebody where we could, that what I just described is more firsthand information. So I think you might find that useful.
Okay. Jeff, did you have something?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, can I ask, so staffing is like a pillar, one of the main pillars. Are there other kind of big picture items that you think would be important for the commission to make sure there's engagement on?
Well, I think we're gonna get to that in the next
Okay, all
section when
right,
we talk about the role of the commission.
Right.
Let me just ask a couple questions and
Sure.
real quickly here. So the way I look at your chart, you've got 10, I guess, observations that haven't been implemented yet, and nine observations that have been partially implemented. Of those 19, any of them, how would you grade them? Are they significant deficiencies? Are they something that we really should be concerned about? Are
I
they?
think, I don't remember precisely the numbers, but the ones from the commission, we're going to address because those were ones, and it's things like improving the self-assessment, having more of a strategic agenda. Some of those things we think that weren't implemented by the commission contributed to the commissioners now saying, what should our role be? So we're gonna talk about those a little bit. And there was another batch that were for the General Assembly, which in 2014, we made a number of recommendations, and 80 or 90% of them were implemented by the General Assembly. We have some residual ones that we keep repeating that we recognize that the General Assembly may choose not to continue to not do, but we think they're important for better aligning authority and responsibility. So we're going to continue to make those. The ones at the staff level, I think were minimal. There were a few partial, but generally, I think the staff has implemented the vast majority of our recommendations.
So your observations wouldn't be considered, I call significant deficiencies or material weaknesses or anything? Okay. And my other question was, you mentioned information flow from the staff level to the board level, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that? Because I was a little confused on that.
Sure, the regular reporting that we see that you're getting, it's big, but the information is complete and thorough and transparent in every way. So that's what we were thinking in terms of the investment program and the information that you're receiving.
So are we getting that information?
Yes.
Oh, we are getting it?
Yeah, I think
Our understanding.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay.
Well, doesn't it say here additional layer in bullet 2?
I missed.
Yeah.
I think that's related, Bill, I think that's related to
Risk,
risk
yeah,
metrics.
the risk reporting.
Yeah, the risk reporting.
Okay.
is-
Yes.
Doing more there.
Yeah, which is something that we
That's your committee.
recognize as something that we need to.
The risk side is
Yeah.
something that,
Okay.
you're not alone in struggling with this issue either. The risk is a different frontier from traditional investment performance reporting.
Yep.
And it's tough, and the learning curve that you're on is great, but we can see that being something that you could absolutely improve over time.
Thank you.
Mr. Condon?
Yeah, I just talked about the HR committee from an audit and enterprise risk management committee perspective. We hear about staffing issues too, because staffing is on our risk matrix.
Right.
And it's colorful. It's, it's brought out to us quite often, on the chart. So it's something we do talk about.
Red hot.
So we hear about it from a different perspective. So now we've got most of the commission hearing about staffing on a fairly routine basis. But I have wondered, and I don't really have an answer to this, and maybe we just rely on the committee, the current structure, but I have wondered, when I'm sitting in a committee meeting, well, maybe the rest of the members want to see this level of detail too, or hear this discussion, because generally the committee reports are somewhat, summarized. So anyway, that's just a thought. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but I just thought I'd throw out that thought that I've had numerous times.
Well, it seems like thematically what we're talking about when it comes to reporting is right sizing, right? It's not necessarily that, it's too much or too little. It's getting it so that it's more, I think it feels like it's more, from looking at your report, thematically throughout, it seems like it's more geared towards digestible than it is necessarily like it's not that the information's not there. It's just maybe there's a little bit better way to package it and incorporate it into, so it draws the red, the color that draws the eye to the part of the heat map for ERM that shows, the staffing is always a risk, right? So I think it's that kind, you've said
Having a
throughout.
good summary.
Yeah, you've said throughout
of the
exception-based
structured way.
reporting is.
You're doing better than most, to be honest, so
Yeah.
I don't think we want to be critical here. But
Sure,
I think
no.
in terms of incremental improvements, to make sure you consistently have a good executive summary at the beginning, and then you can selectively look at the details behind it as interesting, because they're there.
Right, yeah. But it's more the mapping, right, to the.
Yes.
Yeah, I got you.
And if you can use tools to have things like hyperlinks and so forth, so when you're looking at it online, if you can click on items in the topics in the executive summary that would take you back to the detail, that's really what we see as leading practice. Not very many funds are doing that, but we would see that as leading practice.
And I'll go back to your original question, the specific examples. One of the things we mentioned in the report was the idea of during your kind of asset class reviews, there's always a sensitivity on staffing. It's something you can always do more with more staffing, and just discussing the trade-offs at that time of this is the resources we have, this is what we could do if indeed you went further, and this is our constraints because of where we are right now is something that's actionable, and that could be in each of the asset class reviews, and we mentioned that in the report. So.
I've got one more question, please, Mr. Chairman.
The floor is yours, Mr. Condon.
On the fourth bullet, improving education and engagement, I got a question about maybe about what the level that what you find is the level of engagement, what needs to get improved. I mean, we're here, we're meeting as a board, we meet as committees, we vote, but are you really saying so we are engaged to a certain degree, to a large degree, but are you saying we need to drive the ship more as opposed to staff? Well, what is that engagement that needs to be improved?
The comment came from the perspective of the monitoring effort and the strategy effort, and really understanding. For instance, we heard in some of the interviews the area of risk management is an area that's learning and growing, and that education can lead to greater engagement on those types of issues. You do a great job on the investment level, the asset class level of educating and an engagement, but some of the more nuanced areas is where our comment was coming from.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
So I want to talk a little bit about what we're asked to look at in terms of the role of the commission. As I mentioned, you've made many improvements over the last 4 years. Your committees appear to be functioning well. You've told us, and we interviewed most of you, there are a couple of newer commissioners that we hadn't had a chance to interact with yet, but those that we spoke with reported that they really feel they have an opportunity to say what they want to say and to be heard, in that it's a collegial environment. And when we look at you've made some major policy decisions, as we've talked about, and Steve has talked about, your decision in 2017 to delegate significant investment approval authority to staff, as well as the simplification of the asset allocation. We would view those both as being very successful, both in direction and implementation. In the more recent decision to change the compensation structure to try to make it more effective, it's too soon to tell the results. From what we see, we think it makes sense, and we expect that you'll see success from that as well. So from a kind of decision-making, policy-making standpoint, I think you can congratulate yourselves. You've really made some good moves that have shown positive impact. As Steve has mentioned, the combination of simplifying asset allocation and finding the right balance with internal, external resources, and focusing on where you can add the most value. Again, strategically makes a lot of sense, and we see it that as having been well executed. And fund performance by all accounts has dramatically improved and is now compares favorably to peers. So there's certainly a lot of good news. Looking at the staff, it's very clear in talking to the commissioners, you have a very high level of confidence in both the CEO and in the overall leadership team and staff. And our view is it is a very competent staff. And you've also told us you feel you have the opportunity to be prepared for the commission meetings, that the CEO has briefings, and if you avail yourself of that, you feel like you're in a good position to participate effectively. From you and from staff, we've heard that there's a strong ethical tone at the top, see evidence of that. We've reviewed your governance policies. We think they're effective. Risk management has been significantly improved. This is a topic that most systems struggle with. We think you've done probably a better job than most, but it's still, the job's not finished, but it's going in the right direction. As Steve has said, you've told us you believe investment reporting has improved and is currently effective. The one area, again, to not be redundant, but is risk management, which will probably always be something that you'd like it to be better. Again, we think you're doing well there, but it's something to continue to focus on for more improvements.
Randy,
Yes.
when you think about like folks who do that well, what does that involve? High level, I don't want you to get down in the weeds, but like folks who do investment risk reporting and integrating that into the decision making, I think we would be and we don't have to necessarily cover this here, but we would be very interested in seeing some, examples of that and how, the folks that you guys consider to be
Yes.
best
Are you
practice.
referring to investment risk or non-investment
Investment
risk?
risk.
Because
I
you're
think
doing a lot in the non-investment risk standpoint with ERM as well.
Yeah, I think investment risk reporting, because that's just the thing that's, it's hard to, I think it's more difficult to get it's more difficult to integrate that into, I think it's easier to show it. It's more difficult to integrate it, right? So I think it's a combination of who does that well.
One of the things that I'll say is who does it well with your budget? Because this is an area you can spend significant amounts of money in terms of data manipulation and reporting. With your budget, I think you do it very, very well. But your plans and larger can spend significant efforts with systems and can get much more consolidated reporting. And you just look at the big guys and the money that they spend on systems, and you'll see who is doing it very, very well.
This is Christmas morning for James Wingo right now.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
And we're not trying to imply we don't think you do a good job in this area, because we do think you do better than most, for sure.
No, I think
It's more, I think what we heard from the commissioners is saying, we'd like to better understand it.
No, and this comes strictly from a sense of humility that, yes, we may do it well, and, maybe we do it better than some, and certainly not as good as others. but it's just kind of that, I mean, it honestly is it's a struggle to figure out how you incorporate it more necessarily than how you determine it, right? It's I think that's the step that is more.
Could you give a couple of examples of risk reporting and how it's improved? And in other words, could you expand a little bit on that last point there?
I can do that, sure. I would say the move towards a more holistic way of looking at the risk in the portfolio. You've used proxy ways of looking at your hedge fund reporting, private equity reporting, and others, and looking at the holistic risk of the portfolio as opposed to the equity portfolio risk or the fixed income portfolio risk or some of the risks in an independent way in the alternatives program. And that's what I think you've made a lot of progress on. And it's quite complex. You made a lot of progress on that over the last 4 years.
I think some of that was facilitated by the simplified asset allocation.
That's right.
Yeah.
Is there some way of, sorry, I'm new to the commission.
Sure.
Is there some way of developing a composite index of overall portfolio risk?
You're
A weighted index of something.
a weighted benchmark index, or you're trying to pull it together right now in terms of a composite portfolio. And
Yeah.
then you have benchmarks in each of the asset classes, and you can create a benchmark risk.
Okay.
You do get that with your CEM reports. They do have a risk index that they compare the asset allocation to others
Okay.
that are in their database. And I would guess that Veris can also provide some input on that as well.
And that's going to be a topic that we're going to hear from Veris a little bit later on, and they're going to talk about a risk tolerance survey that they're going to do with the commission. So I think that'll be helpful and insightful as well.
Right.
So.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, so let's go to the next. So in terms of recommendations then, many of you told us you thought the role of the commission was continuing to evolve and could be improved. I think we've talked about you've made some good decisions. Despite that, there was kind of a gnawing discomfort, I think, in many of you that are we really doing all of the things we should be doing? And what we believe is you should really spend time among yourselves discussing what is the direction, what's the oversight that we need to be providing, how do we need to provide it by setting your own strategic agenda, not just for the organization, but for the commission itself. And part of that is to be more actively involved in the strategic planning process that is led by staff, but to be involved in it in a way that at the beginning you're having a discussion about what should the plan be involved, what should be the issues that we're addressing, and then have the staff come back to you at a couple of points during the process to make sure that they're getting your input and that it's also feeding back into your own thoughts about, as a commission, the role you want to play and the things that you think are important for the commission to accomplish. Also, the whole, and we understand you're working on this, but changing the role you've had with your general investment consultant, we think is really central to having a better feel and sense of the role that you're playing and being able to feel that you have effective oversight. It clearly is in process. Developing the effective relationship seems to be underway. One of the things, and this was a recommendation from 4 years ago that didn't get implemented, we think it would be very helpful for you to have an annual discussion with your investment consultant about how did you do this year? Did you meet our expectations? What else would we have liked to have seen? And then transition that into here's what we as a commission have for priorities for the upcoming year. Just as you would with an employee or with your CEO. You should view your consultant in a similar vein that you need to have that interaction. There needs to be mutually understood expectations, and there needs to be feedback on are they meeting them or not. That's just simply good management practice, good governance practice in this situation. So we again recommend that to the commission. And part of it as well is, I think, and this can be difficult, you've got now an incumbent chair that's going to be chair for more than a year. It's often difficult with boards and commissions that have a kind of a rotating chair position every year, but that role of the chair needs to be strong in taking the lead in a number of things, but one of which is also in the role with the investment consultant. In boards that have an investment committee, it's typically the investment committee chair. But in your case, you serve as kind of an investment committee as a whole. So the chair needs to make sure that the relationship is developing, that there's a rapport with all of the commissioners, that there's an ongoing discussion. And again, we understand this is already happening, that there are regular discussions between the board chair and the consultant. And just to make sure that the commission is getting the input that they want. So the chair needs to play a role in that, and we think that if you make this consultant relationship work effectively, it will address a lot of the issues that you raised with us in terms of feeling like we know what we need to know and we're providing effective oversight. Another area, and I think everyone, all the commissioners that we talked to acknowledge this, is, you've been very comfortable because you have a very high level of confidence in your CEO. But when we said, have you done any succession planning? He said, well, really not formally, we probably need to do more. And so again, I think this was a recommendation last time as well. It is something that we think you should have a plan for. And typically the kinds of measures that we see, if there was an unexpected departure for whatever reason, or an extended absence, knowing who would take the role on an interim basis, if you had to make a replacement, how would we do it? Would we retain outside assistance? If so, how would we go about doing that? Would we form a subcommittee? How would we do that? Just to have a plan in place. And then in addition to that, I think you've got enough bench strength here, you can have reasonable discussions about who are the internal candidates and how ready are they for that role. And you could have input to the CEO about the CIO position as well. Those things I think would all be, it should be on, I mentioned having a strategic agenda for the commission. That should be a standing item that is on your agenda, that should always be something that you look at. From a CEO evaluation standpoint, we understand you do have a process. I think from what we heard, it could be a little more fulsome. There could be more consistent input from all of the commissioners, and recognizing there will always be some newer ones that maybe don't feel they have enough experience with the situation to provide meaningful input, but nonetheless, it should be taken seriously and have a formal process to make sure that you get as much input as possible. And then in terms of the committee self-assessment process, we understand you've had a process, and frankly, I think many of you said, we think it's been pretty good. We haven't had a lot to say because we feel like things have been going pretty well. But also you said we haven't really had any action steps that come out of them. And I think what we've seen with board self-evaluations is that they result in things changing even when they're going well, that it's in a spirit of continuous improvement. There should be more coming out of your process. And it should include the committee performance as well. We would recommend, we understand this has all been done with internal resources, we would recommend you consider hiring an external facilitator at least for a year or two to develop a more effective process, to kind of kickstart a more meaningful process. And then finally, Commissioner, continuing education, you've had some things, but I think you've also asked for more, and we understand that's been in process. We understand that Robert has been developing that, so that's, from what we can tell, going in the right direction. So we're pleased to see that you're addressing that. Any questions on the role of the commission before we move on to the other areas? Okay, turn it back over to Steve.
For those of you that haven't poured through it, the report is about 120 pages. The last 20 pages or so are kind of detailed recommendations, and getting back to your question, the prioritization of each of those areas. We identified kind of who's accountable for those recommendations. 8 are for the commission, 32 are primarily staff, and I know that there's a lot of progress that has been made on some of those already. 3 for the General Assembly, and 1 for the appointing authorities of this body. So if you want to go through detail, it's there, but I won't bore you with it. What we tried to do was create on a top level the key recommendations, and this is the meat of the report, directed at the commission, a list of decisions in prioritization, almost like you're responsible for this, you're responsible for this, you're responsible for this, and a documentation of responsibilities could be quite helpful, knowing from a commissioner perspective who's responsible. Working with the appointing authorities to ensure that appointments are promptly made at the expiration of commissioner terms. There just seems to have been a mismatch at the commission level for the appointing times, and that's something that could be improved.
Steve, just to let you know, that is throughout state government, that is not, it's in South Carolina, I don't know how it is in other states, that is not in any way unusual. I mean, we don't experience any more of that than, quite frankly, than anybody else does.
Gotcha.
So.
Yes.
Actually, I'm guessing from my work in state government, we probably are handicapped by the fact that we don't report to a particular agency. There's governor appointments, there's constitutional officer appointments, and there's General Assembly appointments. As far as I know, there's no coordination among them to ensure some of the later criteria of geographic, gender, racial, and qualifications diversity. So I think that's a concern I have about the appointment process.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's an issue that necessarily we can.
No, we can't do anything about the structure of South Carolina government.
Yeah.
But it does hamper us in terms of
Sure.
trying to get diversity.
I think sensitizing is all you can do. And
Right. Yeah, and that's in process.
Great.
Okay.
At the staff level, we've kind of beaten this one to a dead pulp, but the talent management is key. You do a great job, and we're not in any way criticizing. You have a wonderful pool of potential applicants right here in terms of the university system. You've just got all it takes, but it's hard to get experienced talent here in South Carolina, and the development of bench strength is really important. And then continuing the path that you're on with enterprise risk management. This is a hard issue. Nobody's truly figured it out yet, but continuing down that path, including integrating quantitative measures of performance, your quantitative group, and exception-based reporting is a real recommendation that we want to point out. For the General Assembly, statutory, I mean, I know this is beyond your control, but we wanted to document it. Statutory authority for budget, staffing, and compensation level approval to better align the different interests that are involved.
Excuse me, can you point out where that's hurting us right now?
Well, I think as it's been pointed out to us, it isn't hurting you right now. The problem is, in the future, it could be, if you don't have a CEO like Mike that has good relationships, maintains the communication, and anticipates challenges and so forth. It's just good governance practice is to have, you've been delegated fiduciary responsibility for managing the fund, but you don't have the authority to hire, compensate, and so forth. That's just a mismatch of authorities.
We've got a really broad, much broader than most state agencies, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, on compensation. What's
Well, I would say
what's the weakness there?
It may not be the majority, but about 30 or 40% of state retirement systems, the board has full autonomy on setting compensation, bonus pools, hiring, staffing levels, procurement, and so forth. They make their own rules, and they have no legislative restrictions or statutory restrictions. That's definitely not the case here. And that we would say that's leading practice, that's aligning the responsibility or the authorities that you have to act on with the responsibilities you have as fiduciaries. And we would say right now, those are not aligned. Again, we understand you're doing well with the structure you've got. You just don't know what's going to happen going forward. And for good housekeeping of your governance framework, we recommend that the General Assembly give you that authority.
To tie it to another recommendation, if we needed to double the spend on risk management, do we have the budgetary space to do that? I mean, is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yes. I mean, our understanding is you've managed it well, you've got cushion, you're not bumping up against any limits at the moment.
Okay.
But you get an economic downturn, everybody gets cuts across the board and so forth. You're being tied to that state system. It can be nefarious. You don't know what's going to happen in the future.
Got it. Thank you.
But, like you say, it's only like 30 or 40% of folks in our shoes that have this kind of autonomy. So we're not living necessarily with constraints that most other
No,
folks.
and you're managing it better than many of them are.
And to a certain extent, probably have less constraints than a lot, right? So,
Yes.
Yeah, we'll probably fall somewhere, I would say, in the middle, or even more towards a little less constrained than a lot of other folks in our positions.
Kind of along the same vein, the procurement process, you just never know, especially as you've gone into your co-investment program, where you might need to hire a certain resource and the procurement process for that. We're just saying should allow for exceptions, because you just never know when legal expenses or other expenses could come up that you need, and especially as you've gone more and more into the alternatives area, and that's a recommendation. Finally, we found that the commissioner qualifications were very rigid and very, very tight, and loosening some of those to allow for it could be more diversity, it could be more skill sets, it could be almost anything, is something that we think could come from the General Assembly.
I'd just like to comment on one that impacted me individually, and that is that one of the categories of a qualification requirement is PhD in economics or finance. And if that basically would now include very few people who are active members of the retirement system, because most people who are academic, people in finance or economics have opted for the defined contribution rather than the defined benefit program.
Yeah.
So that's something that might be.
Yeah, I think the qualifications from like what you would think from the pool of retirees, the qualifications probably don't lend themselves to a lot of potential, diversity or in qualification, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what we're saying, just loosen it.
And we can safely say that South Carolina has far and away the most stringent trustee requirements, commissioner requirements of any state in the union, by far. Most of them that have a skills or experience kind of a requirement, they're relatively broad. Investments, actuarial science, pension administration, and so forth. They're not so narrowly defined, like you have to have a PhD in economics or so forth. That's really well beyond where virtually every other state is.
So in conclusions, I know we've spoken about suggestions for improvement, but in no way do we want to leave here without saying that the leadership and the organization and the staff are doing a great job. Just full stop. Investment returns, I wasn't here in the earlier studies, but you've turned a super tanker in a unbelievably positive way, and the results show in the performance. Leading practices in several areas that we've documented in our report. I don't know how you've done it so well, other than great leadership, but the culture here is wonderful of responsibility, accountability, collaboration where appropriate, independence where appropriate. And it starts with the tone at the top, and you've done a wonderful job of creating a strong culture that has resulted in the strong performance that, without question, from what we've seen among other peers. The delegation decision to staff was implemented in a strategic asset allocation plan. Following that was implemented very, very well. We feel that the next stage of that is where you're at right now in terms of effectively engaging in the oversight function now that the commission has delegated so much responsibility to staff. And in no way are we critical. It's just this is an area for improvement. Every aspect of RSIC has improved at the staff level, at the commission level, and all the related parties. And I think you should applaud yourselves on that improvement over time and keep the good work going. So we'll open this up. I know this has been an interactive session so far, but open it up for more questions.
Questions from the commissioners to our folks at Funston. Mr. Condon,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I saw your hand go up too, so you're next.
I have a couple of questions about proxy voting, which is in your report, but it didn't make the summary. So, first of all, a point of clarification. When you talk about proxy voting and your knowledge of how in a policy, how we think about proxy voting, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if we invest in a fund, that fund has the right to vote, not us. So that's this whole BlackRock issue. So I would say that's not even proxy voting, because certainly not proxy voting for us, because we don't have the right to vote. So it's more in separate accounts where we own the stock. We may hire a proxy or do something like that. So I wanted to confirm your definition of proxy voting before I ask the other questions.
Sure. Every equity, every company has proxies as part of the stock ownership, and that's an asset of the fund. And I think
Of the fund, not of us.
it's an asset of the organization, and therefore it's an asset of the people of the state of South Carolina.
But to clarify that though, Steve, I think what Bill's saying is because we invest, primarily get our equity exposure with BlackRock and State Street through collective investment trust.
Yes.
It's the investment trust, we own basically units in the trust.
Yes.
It's the investment trust that owns the underlying securities, so thereby, it's the investment trust that gets to vote the proxies, not.
But it's our understanding that within the BlackRock situation in particular, you do have the option of picking kind of a general theme of voting. I don't know what that's the right term for.
You can delegate the authority to vote those proxies in the collective trust to BlackRock, which is the vast majority of funds do that. Or you can hire a third party, and BlackRock has made arrangements for you to have someone else vote your proxies.
But that's only recent, is that right?
Yes.
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 That's only
That's very
something
recent.
recent, so.
Yeah, right. Because that's not in our contract.
Yeah.
That's, okay, but I think
It's a recent development
recent,
by
yeah.
which they're allowing folks like us who invest, I think it's called their voter choice program.
yes.
And they're allowing the direction of what would be our pro rata share of the proxies if we own them directly, right? Because we don't own the shares, we don't have the right to vote the proxies. But they're just they're creating a program that will allow us, and we're gonna talk more about this later today, and how we would potentially implement a solution that takes advantage of that. But that is not across the board yet. It's not a solution that is available with every provider like BlackRock.
It's not unusual in the world of institutional investing to have a third party that you choose vote your proxies though. And you would not be in any way breaking new ground to do this should you choose to move away from the traditional approach, which is just have the money manager like a BlackRock or anyone else vote those proxies.
Right, but as I understand it right now today, we don't own a proxy to vote in those accounts. So So where I'm headed is, y'all do say about monitoring proxy votes.
Yes.
And it sounds wonderful, is able to meet, we should make sure the manager is able to meet the obligations to vote proxies in the interest of the retirement system and their participants. But if they own the proxy, not us, they can kind of vote the way they want to. There's no requirement for them to vote the way we would want them to vote. So really, my main question is, I just want to get your view on whether this board, this commission, whether in your view there's any fiduciary risk. There was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal written by some well-known people, including a former U.S. Attorney General, that basically said, quote, if BlackRock is violating its fiduciary duty, so is the pension plan board member or investment staffer who knowingly invests with BlackRock. And fiduciary duty is not a black or white thing.
Right.
I recognize that, and maybe this is too black and white, but here it is in writing in the journal by respected lawyers, at least on some perspectives, and I just, that's saying we might be violating our duty right now, now that we know BlackRock might be voting ESG related instead of for the benefit of our plan. Is that something y'all considered, or is that something you feel there's any risk for us?
We defer to your fiduciary counsel on that. We're not providing that kind of advice in this particular assignment.
No, but I would think if you saw a risk, you would probably tell us. That's kind of the point of the report. If you see a fiduciary risk in a fiduciary audit, I would think you'd tell us there's a risk and go talk to your lawyer. And maybe that's what you just did. Go talk to your lawyer because there is a risk.
Well, to the extent, it's obviously an evolving topic, an emerging topic.
Yes.
Emerging and evolving quickly, I guess.
Yeah, it is.
And we don't know where it will end up. The statements like that, hadn't been made in the past, and I think that's something we would defer to your fiduciary counsel on giving you any advice on that particular topic. We did not identify it as a fiduciary risk in our review.
Okay. All right, good. I just thought it was my fiduciary duty to ask.
No.
I'm just doing what I think is my duty by asking. So thank you.
Good question.
Holly?
Sometimes the hardest thing to find is the topic not addressed. And our fiduciary responsibility is to the active members and retired members of the retirement system, and to a secondary degree, the taxpayers of South Carolina, who are the ultimate residual obligant in that situation. And I just wondered, in looking at other entities similar to ours, if they publish something like an annual report as a corporate report in which the shareholders, is that a common practice?
Yes, and you do a good job on that too.
Yeah.
Where do I find it?
It's on our website, our annual investment report.
Oh, yeah, but it's not just an investment report. It's other things about the commission as well. And something fairly, light. I guess I have a lot of friends who are retired state employees or active in the retirement system, and they know nothing about RSIC or about the state of their retirement funds. And so I've looked at the reports, the investment reports, but I think it's not just the investment. I think it's something with a little explanation about the commission and what it does, and some very, like maybe something that's 8 pages, something that people would read.
Okay.
Just a
Yeah,
suggestion.
that's probably, that's something we could
Is that
potentially.
something that other entities do?
Yes, you're, compared to the structure that most states have, it's about 60 or 70% that are integrated, where They have invested, one board has responsibility for investments and for pension administration.
Yes, which is.
They
the biggest job.
publish
Yeah.
an annual report. In the case of South Carolina, where you have FIBA and RSIC, FIBA really publishes the full financial statements, that's their responsibility.
Yeah.
But you do have an investment report here annually that links into that.
Yeah,
I guess it sounds like you're asking for some of the other,
well, so
kind of
a summary
context
from
that-
maybe from the two entities, since the head of FIBA is
Yeah, and I'll have to,
Commission.
yeah, that's something that Peggy and I can potentially collaborate on to,
Okay.
to see where we think that if there's some gaps in what because a lot of times their reporting is more forward-facing reporting, and information that they put out is a little bit more comprehensive in that it includes us and how they're managing, in essence, the retirement for members.
But this
Yeah.
is a different audience that would like just to say, how healthy is my retirement system? What steps have you taken to ensure its health? That kind of thing, rather than the degree of detail that might be either on our annual investment report or their FIBA's report.
Okay. Yeah, well, like I said, we'll collaborate on that and see if we
Okay,
can figure
thank
out something that makes sure, you just kind of take a survey of what's out there, and then see if there's a better way to deliver that message.
Thank you.
I think just in general, we've seen tremendous progress in both the website and the content of the website over the last 8 years. And our view was that RSIC is doing a pretty good job of putting materials out there for its constituents.
But the average retiree would not necessarily know that the website exists, know what they're looking for, and looking for something that's less detailed and just more reassurance that your retirement is in safe hands and making progress at full funding. That's all I was thinking.
Sure, yeah, and and Holly, just, I think you're aware, we give regular updates to the Retirees Association.
Yeah.
And try to provide that degree of, of assurance, with the, so we kind of work, but
again-
I think I get where you're going.
Yeah, because the majority of the members of the retirement system, both retired and not retired, are not necessarily part of the retirement association. So it probably would need broader dissemination. Right? Sam?
You're right.
Sam would welcome their membership, right?
Thank
Sounds
you.
good, yes,
All right.
yeah.
Jeff had a question.
Thank you for the comments and a lot to think about for us. Early in the discussion, when you were talking about the gains made in the investment program, you said something, and I want to sort of formally ask your thoughts on this. You described our performance as improving against other plans, and I am steeped in the school of thought that doesn't matter, despite the fact that we now appear to have made great strides against that yardstick. But can you talk about that? Like, should we be concerned with that? Or should we be focused on our backyard and our plot of earth and doing the best in that?
I'll say that performance against benchmark is the better measure of how you're really doing. That being said, I have lived in this world for 4 years. And to say that another state, your peer states right around here, did better than you will come up in the press. And I think you have to be aware of both. And you have to be attentive to both.
But do we manage to that is sort of the question. That's the logical conclusion of this is.
I think you have to be aware of the risk of not managing to it and being prepared to discuss those risks in a public forum if you don't manage to peers and say what indeed you've done, why it's different, and be prepared for backlash.
I mean, we have been beaten with that stick before.
I know.
And I thought it was a bad stick at that time, and now that we're winning that game, I guess, I still think it's a bad way to do it, but,
I
so,
think, again, I start off.
Yeah.
Performance against a benchmark, and the more you go into the alternatives area, the more difficult that benchmark is to evaluate, and the more soft short-term results can be, but you have to be aware of both in my mind.
But don't you think it's important that when we're being compared to other funds, that we know what they're doing that is better than what we're doing. In other words, if they're doing something that is more effective than what we're presently doing for the same objective, we should know about that.
I agree, and one of the comments in the report is on the asset class reviews that you do throughout the year, to comment on maybe what other peers are doing differently than you, and how your strategy is different to allow the commission to be able to judge. Maybe going a way that the peers are doing or not doing is a better path, but being aware is the key.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Any more questions for the folks here from Funston? None? Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you. And we really appreciate the cooperation we've gotten from RSIC. We appreciate the state auditor's office sponsoring us and having confidence in us, and we hope this is of value to all of you.
Thank you very much, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
For the 9 months of the year so far, we've had a really challenging market. The quarter ending September 30th was no exception. Our return was a negative 3.77% during the quarter, which is not something we're excited about, but we are excited about our performance relative to our benchmark. We did outperform pretty meaningfully during the quarter. One thing I do want to call your attention to, because I think this is a useful way of tracking the impact of the 2017 pension reform legislation, is our annual, our one-year net benefit payments are now under $500 million. So that is a very meaningful thing for us, and particularly meaningful in light of the fact that we're paying out less than half of what we once were on an annual basis. And here we are, we're in a down market, and it's a really nice thing to not have to be paying out considerably more.
How do you account for that?
Increased contributions from that, starting from that 2017 legislation, the contribution rates have been ratcheting higher. And the way that we see it is the amount that we're distributing from the corpus of the trust has been declining, and now we're under $500 million. I believe that had gotten close to 1.2 billion, if I'm not mistaken, so it's a material benefit.
Well, that was also when the value of the trust was substantially lower as well.
Yes,
So
yes.
much, from a percentage-wise, a much greater net negative cash flow.
So, a quick look at our framework continues to show, and I'm focusing here for time on the center of the page, continues to show positive outcomes from both our decision to employ a diversified approach, as well as the way that we are going about executing that. Very broadly, it's just good news right now. It is not always the case. One thing that I do think is just interesting to me, because this is ebbs and flows, but over long periods of time, I think that we have the right approach. We compare ourselves to this reference portfolio. As a reminder, that is a 70% equity, 30% investment grade bond portfolio that we believe has the same level of risk over long periods of time as our policy portfolio. And you can see that portfolio has had a very difficult time. And I bring that up because not to tap dance on its grave or anything, that portfolio will have its day.
Well,
But
it's tap danced on ours.
it tapped danced on our grave for a number of years when public equities were the only thing that seemed to make any difference. So unfortunately now, public equities, which are still 40+% of our portfolio, are very much reminding us why diversification is important. So you see our actual outcome of -6 over the last year versus that portfolio down 19. Just a nice reminder, this is why we diversify our approach.
Jeff,
Yes, sir.
can you explain the composition of that reference portfolio and the policy benchmark? How are those constructed? And
Sure.
are they constructed in such a fashion as to influence our returns.
So the policy portfolio is the portfolio that we adopted with a 5-year horizon back in 2020. So that's the portfolio the commission adopted, where we decided we're going to have 5 main asset classes: equities, investment grade bonds, private equity, private debt, real assets. That's what that portfolio is. So that's a more diversified approach. The reference portfolio is 70% public equity, 30% bonds, because those two, on an expected volatility basis, look the same, not an expected return basis. We believed, through the guidance of our prior consulting firm, we believe that the diversified approach will earn, I don't recall exactly, I want to say close to 1% better return on an annualized basis from employing a diversified approach. But that's in a nutshell the difference between those two portfolios. So, have I answered the question? Okay, all right.
Jeff?
Yes, sir.
So the policy benchmark is, when we measure risk and such there, that's, I assume, at using the target percentages.
Yes.
So with our current, overage from the target for private equity, would that show up in
That's
the implementation?
Implementation, but exactly.
Yes.
So that will capture overweights and underweights. It will also capture where we have composed an asset class in a different way.
Yeah.
So an example of
Tips
that
or
is,
something like that.
yeah, would be tips, high yield
Yeah.
versus the bonds portfolio. So it would also be, and this is something I'm about to point out in the very middle of the page, in our real assets portfolio, our benchmark is a core real estate benchmark, but we have infrastructure, we have listed REITs, we have listed infrastructure, so we have some things that are different. And in the middle of the page, we're tracking this is stepwise through this, the policy benchmark versus the reference portfolio shows us the value from employing a more diversified approach. The difference between how, we have actually executed the portfolio, but not yet paying attention to how well our managers did their part. But how do we structure the portfolio is this one. So comparing that against the policy benchmark, we're capturing the difference from that decision to look different. And then over here, the quality of manager selection is, we could have hired anyone to do it. Even after we adjust for the fact that we have infrastructure, now we're asking, how well did our managers execute infrastructure?
Right.
So you can see that's what we're tracking there. So we created this kind of linked chain of the important decisions that take us all the way from what we could have done, the very simple thing, and frankly, none of us would need to be here to oversee that, to, well, we are here, so how did everyone do? And, our actual return flows through those decisions that now we have a way of measuring. So that's the whole point of the framework. So sorry for the long answer.
That's okay. No, it's always good for a refresher, and you certainly answered my direct question. One more question. So, you referred to it, the reference portfolio and the policy benchmark were designed back in 2020 to have the same level of risk, basically.
Yeah.
And you said, I think you just said, over a long period of time, we expect that to stay the same. How do we know? I mean,
How do we know we're not wrong?
you do have different asset classes, so something goes unexpected. How do we know that they're gonna stay in the same level of risk?
Oh, we absolutely don't. Let me start from there. When we talk about that, we're talking about risk measured not the way we're looking at it right now, quarterly, annually,
Right.
over 3 years.
Yes.
We're looking at risk when we set that portfolio. We're thinking as the longest of long-term investors, we're looking at 20, 30 years forward. So over a very long period of time, we know that we're going to see, and actually that your question couldn't set up part two of my discussion here.
Well, you're welcome.
I appreciate that. And I'm giving you credit for setting up part 3 last meeting. So, but let me hang on to part of that. But we're not pretending that risk is so stable and predictable that we knew that for 20 years, when we look at everything, it's going to make sense over all time periods. We know that it won't. So,
But over the long term, we're pretty sure it's going to stay very similar.
well, and we're essentially relying on, all of our managers say past returns are no guarantee of future results.
Right.
But we are basing our expectations for the future, by and large, on the historical patterns.
Well,
So-
you use what you have.
It's what we have,
We
right.
have history.
Yeah, and over long periods of time, you see that those portfolios move together. It's just that they diverge. So it's like very much an overtime, not necessarily at any one time are they going to show the same risk level, which is what you would expect because of it's different and but you're putting your faith in that the value diversification is going to provide you a similar amount of risk, but a better return over time, right? So that's the principle.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I do want to point out, we do have a red number here for the quarter.
Okay, good.
And I don't ever want to be accused of glossing over things that are not great outcomes. So what you're seeing here, and this is the difference between how we executed versus what the target the commission adopted is. So what we're seeing that's causing this to be negative in the quarter is it was a very, very bad quarter for listed things. And inside of our real assets portfolio, which is benchmarked against core real estate, which is a private benchmark, we have listed strategies. So we have about, I think we began the quarter with about 1.7% combined in REITs and listed infrastructure. And during the quarter, frankly, they just behaved like the equity market as opposed to like private assets. So it's sort of, we know that this happens. And in fact, when we look next quarter, that is going to reverse. If today was the end of the quarter, that would entirely reverse. But I do want to make sure that I'm giving you that little porthole into what's happening. So let's drill down into the asset classes for a moment. And during the quarter, all of our asset classes outperformed their benchmarks. Very much not, I do not want you to get accustomed to that. That is a very atypical result. One thing I do think is interesting, and this is not necessarily something that's you see clearly on the page, but it is something I'm proud of our team for. We had a big recovery in fiscal year 2021, massive recovery, and we outperformed. And our people gave us excess returns across, a lot of our asset classes. Now we're in the opposite environment, where the markets are going against us, and we're still seeing good outcomes. So I don't want that to be lost on anyone. Will that persist forever? Of course not. We don't believe we have solved every riddle, but I do think it's worth taking a moment to congratulate our staff on that. They're the smart ones. I just get to tell you about all the good things.
Hold up, Jeff. Mr. Condon,
Yes, sir.
raise his hand.
I swore to myself silently I wouldn't ask any more questions, but I got one more. Private equity, I love all that green, and I know there might be a lag in reporting with private equity, but do we expect a write-down eventually? And if so, when? It just seems really unusual that
Yeah.
private equity can stay strong when public equity didn't.
Yep, great question. Don't feel bad about asking
So
this question.
I keep waiting, which
Yeah.
quarter are we gonna
Yep.
see this big
Yeah.
private equity markdown?
So I'll give you a couple of little vignettes on that. So one, I absolutely expect that what we saw with private equity outperforming public by 20%, 25%, 30%, that is not normal. And those returns will converge over time. Now, do I believe that it's going to be private equity marking down or private equity being flat as the equity market recovers? I don't know. I do believe, though, that you will see that convergence happen. It's not something we can trade, so we can't very easily say, hey, our private equity is up. Now that the public equity market's down, 24%, why don't I just take that private equity and put it in public equity? And, we don't have that ability to do that, but I think you're right. Now, the other thing I would say is, for 5 years between, call it 2012 and 2017, the opposite was true. The public equity market was red hot and private equity wasn't keeping up. So it's sort of like, I want to make sure that we're asking that question in those times too, because it's a good question in either situation, because what we have just seen is not typical. I don't believe that it will reverse and all of that benefit will dissipate. But the magnitude of what's just happened is not something that's sustainable.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
On a historical basis, do you use any kind of measurement, a spread between public equity and private equity as you would do in private debt and public debt?
Yeah.
Where you normally look at a spread and the spread between, say, junk bonds and high quality. So do you look at any kind of a spread that you make your decisions on?
Yep, that's a great question, and I want to invite Mark to offer feedback on this too. But generally speaking, what we see is for just kind of generic private equity, like the whole universe of private equity, we think that is 3% to 5% historically better on an annualized basis. Whether that remains that significant, I don't know either.
Right.
But let me open the door for Mark.
When we're doing our forward-looking assumptions, we generally, it's in that 3 to 4% range of a premium over the public markets. However, to Jeff's point, we would argue that if that was what you were expecting to earn over time, that you wouldn't do it. Or you'd be neutral between private and public. So I think one of the keys
If you look
here.
at the 5-year relationship between public equity and private equity, it's been pretty much in favor of private equity.
Right.
Much bigger spread.
Right, and that's part of that is the fact that you've invested in partnerships that have done, and your co-invests have done better than the median private equity.
Yeah.
So, and that's really what you're looking for. Again, if we went into this and said, well, you're gonna earn 3% more than public markets, you might take that on, but there's a lot, you're taking on the liquidity risk and other risk as well that goes along with it. So we generally, when we do an asset liability study for you, we're gonna assume 3% more or ballpark,
Minimum.
depending on the market. But then we expect that you would implement and earn more than that over time.
Okay. Indeed.
Jeff, just
Yes, sir.
so I'm clear, two things. When you set the benchmarks for the budgets,
So the commission actually sets the benchmarks based on recommendation of the consultant, which you guys didn't
We
make
did
the
not,
recommendations, our prior consultant did. So the target, the policy portfolio, which is this portfolio, the targets for that portfolio and the benchmarks are set at the same time. And we're currently in a 5-year cycle. We're very close to halfway through it at this point.
Yeah,
But those were set in April of 2020, to take effect on June 30th of 2020. But that's a conversation. Now we have a new perspective from Verus, so.
Well, and for the record, I mean, we've reviewed the current benchmarks and we think they're appropriate on an asset class by asset class.
you're not trying to sandbag it then.
Right.
My other question, I think I figured. The alpha hedge fund
Yep.
column is not included in the total plan.
The total plan return, it is.
It is.
So
It doesn't have a benchmark.
the percent weight is not.
Has not.
Because we create a package of the hedge funds and synthetic instruments in our fixed income portfolio, and now actually a little bit in our equity portfolio as well. And those two things become attached, so
Yep.
when combined, they don't take up more shelf space
Gotcha.
from a cash perspective.
And if you think about the benchmark for that, it's really cash, because as long as the cash is basically the proxy for the cost of the swap and the overlay, or the futures and contract and the overlay. So to the extent that you're outperforming cash, you're adding value.
And if I'm not mistaken, David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we are looking at not the actual performance of our hedge fund portfolio, but the excess return over that cash rate, over these time periods. So that gives you a sense, just by looking at this one line, you don't need a benchmark. It's just, if it's positive, that means it's adding value. If it's negative, it means it's actually hurt the returns by having it. Let me skip, since it's only 3 months of data, I do want to make sure that I address compliance pursuant to state law. As has been the case for the last several quarters, we do have two things of note here on our compliance page, and we're going to have a conversation later today about this. So as has been the case for the last several quarters, the strong performance in our private equity portfolio, and frankly, more broadly across all of the alternative space, has propelled us out of compliance because our net exposure of 15.7 lies outside of the band of 5 to 13%. Is not something that I am ashamed of, since it comes from success. But it is something that we came up with this for a reason, and we're just obligated to report to you regardless of the reason when we lie outside of the bands of the allowable ranges. And also, we do have a secondary constraint that is 0 to 30% for all private markets, which is, this number is not going to be simply the sum of the private asset classes, because we have some listed strategies inside there, but we go ahead and we add all of the private assets up, and we're well north of our allowable range, which at 30% was very tight to begin with to the targets of all three combined.
Just to semantically clarify that is a notification provision, that is not necessarily a constraint, like the upper bound of the allowable ranges. So, because if you add up the targets for the private asset classes, you get to just below 2% of that, so.
The other thing I'd add, even though I know Jeff said we don't manage to our peers, I think, and just to know, any of your peers that are investing in private equity right now are having the same issue. It's just the nature of the beast.
So, I do love the peers. One final thing, and I feel that given the presentation we just sat through, I should spend about an hour on this. This is our perspective on risk, as expressed in the volatility of our plan. Our risk model readings show us, and you don't have this compared to last quarter, but I'll share this with you. This relates to our forward estimate of volatility in the plan. These numbers in the top row are higher by more than 1%, all of them between 1.3 and 1.5. And the relative risk figures in the middle are higher as well. So what we're picking up is just more risk in the entire ecosystem. And the relative risk that we see is most pronounced when we measure the volatility of the difference between outcomes in our reference portfolio and our policy portfolio. It's really because the reference portfolio is that's where we're seeing the most volatility. So anything compared to that is going to show higher relative risk. And then we do like to look, these are the numbers from the last page, so that's looking ahead. If we look at measured volatility over the past 3 years, you can see that we have been perhaps overestimating the risk relative to what has actually been observed just by looking at the standard deviation of our returns. But woe be unto the investor who underestimates risk. So we think that's a better place to be, having an eyes wide open sense of the potential energy in our portfolio. So let me pause here and see if there are any questions. Okay. If there are none, Mr. Chairman, I'll move to the next topic.
Please do so.
Once I get through our voluminous footnotes. So what I want to do here is share some background on our fee data for last fiscal year. And this was a very interesting year for reasons that will become clear in a moment, because there were things that were very meaningful in terms, or meaningful for you to understand, both that affect both our returns for the year as well as the cost of the plan for the year. So let me get going here. Our aggregate fees and expenses during the year totaled $696 million during the fiscal year that ended in June. And given the fact that our total plan return was negative, we just think it makes sense to dive a layer deeper into this to give you a better understanding for the source of this cost, and you know, kind of look at whether or not you believe that there are more questions to be asked. Bottom line, and I'll show you this on the next slide, is our alternatives massively outperformed not only the traditional assets, but also their long-term expected returns. So we had a great outcome in part of our portfolio that was basically masked entirely by the uniquely bad outcome in the traditional assets in the portfolio. And I'll dive into the detail in that. And, you know, I want to make sure that I say this very clearly. During the last fiscal year, each of our alternatives asset classes outperformed what in 2020 we underwrote, you know, with our then consultant as the expected return. We did much better than that across the board. And therefore, because there are performance fees associated with that, that's where this cost is coming from.
Jeff, why do you expect on that last point, why do you expect them to converge?
It is basically, I believe in mean reversion. If something has a great kind of 2-3 year period, it's harder for it to continue to perform above trend. So it's sort of like we have the 20-year forecast. We know that there are going to be periods where these strategies do better, and we know there are going to be strategies or times when these strategies do worse. But I'm adhering to this long view of the expected returns of each asset class, saying if equity markets are down now, I believe that means that they're going to do better on a go-forward basis, as opposed to, you know, if they're doing badly now, therefore I believe they're going to continue to do badly. So I'm giving a lot of credit for mean reversion in that.
If that being true, then would it follow then that you would have some reallocation of assets between the two?
It's very challenging to reallocate into or out of alternatives. So it's sort of like that's a slow moving, with the exception, I guess, of our hedge fund portfolio. That's a place where we have more flexibility to adapt.
I guess my point is, if the returns in both asset classes converge and are very close to each other, what is the benefit of having alternative assets?
I think what Jeff's saying is they converge to their expected outcomes, right? Where we would still expect private equity to outperform over time, it's just that they would converge more towards expectations, because right now we have this significant dislocation where you think about public equity was down, 16, Jeff? And private equity was up 29.45, right? And, that's
Those are gonna look closer together.
Those are gonna look closer together at some point,
Oh, okay.
I think that's because you have this tremendous dislocation.
So are you saying the rate of change is going to converge rather than the actual rate of return, the rate of change in the return? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's more, no, I think it's the amount of actual return
amount
we
of
would see,
actual
we would see converge over on an annualized basis, but when that gets kind of factored into a longer term, where you really see that effect of, we would expect the returns to converge on an annual basis, but then that would play through also to the longer term expected returns that we would expect to get out of those asset classes. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. They're not converging toward each other, they're converging toward.
They're basically mean reverting back to what we would expect from each asset class.
Converging back toward the mean.
Yeah, and then they
Okay,
would, then
got it.
that makes them come closer together.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
right.
Put differently, I guess, we have a 20-year expectation. We know that there are gonna be years like this, but we're not gonna change our behavior and pretend that that's past as prologue.
Right.
We know that there's a bad year at some point, so we're just,
Okay.
we're gonna remain disciplined.
One comment, just in case there needs to be any clarification from anybody to me. But what I also heard, to answer to one of my questions earlier, was that this difference between private equity and public equity, it may be that private equity underperforms as public equity maybe comes out of all of its losses. So this convergence, that may be a necessary step or a part of this overall convergence that may take longer. Is that a fair?
That's very fair.
Right. Okay.
Generally speaking, and Mark, please correct me if you see this differently at all. My experience is in times when you have maybe a 5-year return for public equity that's 20% or thereabouts, private equity does not outperform during that time.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And
In what period?
So when public equity does substantially
Okay.
better than its long-term expectation.
Yeah.
It's the best performing.
Yeah.
Private equity is not, because it has some magic, it's not guaranteed to outperform that. We expect it to not outperform that.
That's what you
during
were
those
saying was
periods of
happening in
time.
12 to
Bingo.
13, 14,
Exactly.
whatever, that period.
That's
Okay.
exactly right.
So think of it as like a sine wave almost, that there are periods when it's feast and there's periods of famine.
Right.
How did
for-
that work in 2021 when you had an extremely good public equity market?
Both were very strong and very similar.
44,
40s, I'm sorry.
It was 44 private, 41 public. So,
So-
but then it's interesting, Ed, because you move that forward 6 months, right? And the difference is 50 for private, 18 for public, which is still a good outcome for public, right?
Yeah.
But so it's the interesting when you adjust the time period, there's a recency, bias to it as well. So it's an interesting.
So let me just crack this open here. So I'm going to show you two ways of thinking about this. First way is let's just crack the plan into two parts. One is the traditional assets, the other is the alternative assets. Traditional assets lost 13%, but only cost $14 million. The alternative assets earned 20%, but cost, this is where, substantially all the cost sits. So every year when we tell you what the fees are, there's an easy shorthand for this. If we paid a lot, it's because our alternatives did well. If we aren't paying a lot, they didn't do that well.
Success fee.
Yeah, well, yeah, that is a tax on success. I like that. And to be clear, alternatives here is not only private equity, private debt, real estate, but it's also hedge funds. So it's not privates per se, it's alternatives more broadly, and that is, you should regard that as code for much higher cost strategy.
But if we took that accrued cost of $681.7 million and we compared it to the true, not whatever the 20% equates to in real dollars, I assume we would observe that we would gladly pay that fee year after year after
Yes.
year.
I'm glad you asked that question.
Okay.
So, the difference, because, well, let me put it to you this way. If we, the alternative to having the portfolio we have would be if we had our reference portfolio.
Right.
So, because that's the same risk, we would have a lower expected return, so, but not negative 13%.
Right.
So the plan is better off after all of these fees and expenses by more than $5 billion.
Oh, there you go.
So,
Nice
so,
number.
but, we'll look at this at some point and it will be the opposite. We paid a good amount and we didn't get a better outcome. So, this is not, there's no guarantee on how this looks, but this is a very extreme version of this, which is why Mike and I wanted to have this conversation with you about this. So,
And this is really in the vein of exception-based reporting, right?
Right.
This is a real-life example of what Funston's talking about. We had a interesting outcome, right? Because there's a big fee number, there's a low return. So we wanted to, provide the commission with an explanation as to why that is, because it's something that we think you should be paying attention to.
but is this the thing that we should expect every year? Absolutely not. Let's look at that. So our expected return for the plan when we adopted our asset allocation was 7.2. So we're nearly we're over 8% worse than that because of the dismal returns available in public markets last year. Does that mean we don't want them? Absolutely not. When I talk about the convergence, I believe that horse will have its day. So let's look at private markets, and I'm just blending private equity, private debt, and real assets together. Those assets have combined an expected return of 8%, but they generated a 23% rate of return, nearly 3 times better. Our portable alpha hedge funds portfolio. Please recall, we're not trying to take a high level of market risk here. We're trying to generate an excess return without taking market risk. So we don't expect this portfolio to look at all like this portfolio. And lo and behold, it didn't, much to our benefit. So we expected 4.9, we earned 12.1. So that has no lag. That is, these are securities in these portfolios, so there is not, a lag effect happening that will unwind that. So,
Can I make one point real quick, Jeff? Sorry.
Mike, I would love it if you did.
Thank you. I think some of the kind of the elegance in this, if you think about it, is, the volatility in public markets that can lead you to the outcome that you see on the left provides the opportunity that allows you to avail yourself for hedge funds to get the return on the right? So that's a nice offset, by availing yourselves of what would otherwise be a negative environment.
This slide should be like the poster child for diversification, because this is the reminder, why does it benefit you at times? It doesn't benefit you all the time, to not rely on a single risk factor for your return.
And you can intuitively deduce that we were heavily weighted in the traditional assets, thus the net negative return.
Yeah, exactly. Well put. So to sum it all up, the alternative strategies were the best thing that we had, but they were also, unfortunately, from a cost perspective, not very friendly to us. So we just thought, in light of the oddity of paying this much in management fees and all expenses, we thought it made sense to spend a moment and just kind of take stock of this. So let me pause to see if there are any questions.
I don't have a question, I was gonna say.
Mike, if you have a comment.
I think one of the things that we didn't show, which I think is also instructive, is, if let's think, this is really the tale of two portfolios, traditional assets, which are our, public assets, and our private assets and alternatives. If our public assets would have had had a year where they experienced the returns that we would have forecast, right? And we would have still had the same return in privates, so in alternatives where we would have ended up with a positive, probably a pretty, decently sized positive return. Costs wouldn't really differ that much, because the implementation cost for our public, asset classes is so cheap. Even if it would have been positive, the return, the impact that would have had on fees would have been negligible.
And they're not a derivative of performance, whereas the fees in the private market is a derivative of performance.
Exactly.
Correct. Yeah, there's no.
Very sensitive.
Is there any performance fee embedded in the traditionals, or is it just?
Brian, is there anything? I feel like we have one manager with a little over $100 million that has Caspian.
They're not considered a hedge fund, though.
No, but they're in the traditional portfolio.
Yeah.
Like on this page, they're over here.
Yeah, but their benchmark is more relative value, though.
Yep.
So.
Yeah.
It would
But-
be.
So that is the only sensitivity on that page. So that is on this page, not having a significant contribution to that number.
Right.
So,
Got a comment, please?
yes, sir.
So, yeah, I mean, we're talking about it, the gross number of fees looks high, but I just did some math, and that 681 million fee for alternatives, and I added up the alternatives from our current report, 19.8 billion, that's 3.4%. Now, to me, I was surprised, that sounds somewhat reasonable. I mean, it's less than I thought it would be with that big number. We're paying 2 and 20 on a lot of things, and so you expect it to be over 2. And I don't know, that just said we'd like it less, but again, it kind of surprised me that it was only 3.4%.
Well, I think too, if you think about that management fee portion, right, not take out the carry and the other expenses portion, that's really has remained constant. There's not a real necessarily difference in that. It's really all the excess cost that you see is just in the performance, right? It's outperforming, the preferential rates of return that we have in the various managers that we, that make up that portfolio.
Is it pretty consistent between manager in terms of rates they charge?
It varies by asset class.
Asset class.
A little bit by manager, and so, there's some variance, but it's something that we are very cognizant of when we do our due diligence.
Bill Condon, I think another reason that we're pleasantly surprised by that percentage, it's got a lot to do with the co-investment stuff that we're doing. That keeps it really, we're not even paying what you would normally expect to pay because of the co-investment we've got going in, and we're not living under that. So.
Yep. Yeah. Given the overweight to all of the alternatives actually is raising the cost. But we do have strategies in the portfolio, and actually we'll talk about some of these later on today to help mitigate some of that. Okay, any further questions before I close out my comments with one more discussion? All right. Mr. Chairman, the final thing I wanted to discuss, actually, this is credit to Mr. Condon. It relates to a suggestion of his at the last meeting. We have a considerable amount of our portfolio in passively managed equity index products. And he suggested we just have a discussion and kind of revisit the rationale for why we have made that decision and how we selected the platforms specifically that we employ. So in 2020, as we discussed, we shifted our portfolio, our public equity portfolio to 100% passive index funds. For years, we had used various flavors of active management and enhanced management for I think it was 15 years, and quite frankly, Brian and I and Mike and I, we were frustrated by our results. So for us, going passive was the solution to a problem that we had. And we wanted an approach that would not only meet the benchmark, which we had been struggling to do consistently, but exceed the benchmark on a consistent basis. And in order to do that, we knew that we were going to go in search of some very low-cost index products. The result for us that you can see in italics here has been that we've, and I believe I'm being very conservative here, we've improved our returns by at least 75 basis points in our equity portfolio. And that, as you see there, has $120 million annual value to our returns. So I want that as the backdrop that we were frustrated. We found a solution to earn more and pay less, and it's frankly that simple. So, but we have a couple of questions that we thought would make sense to be asked, and we'll answer them as well. So I really just addressed this, but why passive index exposures versus actively managed funds? For reasons I just expounded upon, we weren't getting the outcomes we want. This was a clear way for us to improve the returns at the plan level. And in 2020, we asked for, and the commission agreed to allow us to convert the entire global equity asset class to entirely passive exposure. So, another question: what factors are most important to us with respect to the platforms that we employ? And this is an interesting discussion for us, because it takes us into why BlackRock, why State Street, why these firms are the ones who are executing all of that for us. So why did we choose them? We developed in our research a very strong preference for firms that were able to enhance returns through what's called at the source tax reclaim process. This is what enables us to not worry about this, and because we truly see that we have structural excess return in our portfolio from this. And what that means at the source is, Betsy, I'm going to put you on the spot in a moment for what country it is that we're not getting the outcome that we would like. But back when we had to do the tax reclaims, you have to basically ask every country for what they withheld from dividends. You have to ask for that money back. And we are entitled to that money back by virtue of tax treaties the U.S. has, because we are a tax-exempt investor, a sovereign. So we are entitled to reclaim in a number of jurisdictions those funds. State Street and BlackRock have products that do that, essentially, I'm not going to say in real time, but very close to real time. So we don't have to go and argue for that money. And Betsy, what country is it, and how long have we been trying to get?
Norway.
Norway.
None of our.
Country I love dearly.
Yes,
but
since 2016, they basically don't consider our pension fund a resident of the U.S. under the U.S.-Norway tax treaty because of some obscure language, because we're not actually taxed in the U.S. So no pension fund in the U.S. would be considered a resident of the U.S., so we don't get the benefit. I mean, we've appealed it and it's gone up as high as it can go in the Norway tax court, but yeah.
So, well, yeah, so these types of, I mean, these are not investment decisions, these are operational structures that allow us to just efficiently solve this problem. So, we don't ask State Street and BlackRock to have any opinion about what stocks to own. They own what is in the index, and we outperform by virtue of this kind of structural benefit that they offer to tax-exempt investors. I mentioned low fees. I'll explain how low in just a moment. And the other thing that draws us to platforms like this is the scale of the platforms. And we see the benefits of scale in the very low cost to trade, opportunities to cross. If we want to be selling when somebody else is buying, there's a way for us to, it's called crossing, so we don't pay the cost of liquidating our position or vice versa. And, the other thing that has value to us is we like the fact that there's a menu of options that we have. So if we need to customize our exposure, we can do that without sacrificing lowest cost and sacrificing these benefits that we describe here. So, two obvious questions: what do they cost? And frankly, also, how much would it cost should we decide we wanted to switch? So we're paying 3 basis points in essence on these exposures. This is this, along with our synthetic exposures, the least expensive form of investment that we have available to us. So 3 basis points for BlackRock, 3.6 for State Street. I don't imagine, there's really not much more I can say about that. But I'll tackle the second question: how much would it cost should we decide to make a change? If we liquidate, we have to not only sell a portfolio, we have to buy it somewhere else. That round trip trade we estimate is costing more than $11 million. If the new, but thing I want to really drive home, if the new firm that we invest in does not have the solution relating to tax reclaims, we now have a situation where as much as $75 million per year could be at risk from the failure to reclaim the tax revenue that we are owed in foreign jurisdictions. So I want to make that point clear as well. Yes, sir.
I've got a question about the $11 million cost, but I certainly recognize your last point as maybe being more important. Just trying to understand the cost. So we're buying into an index fund. Are they charging us a redemption fee?
No, Brian, I want you to chime in if I say anything that is not factual here. There are different types of costs. You have costs in a jurisdiction to transact in their securities. We charge in the U.S. anyone who trades something, there's a tiny little, few cents fee.
So is that a cost of the fund that they then pass through to us?
Exactly.
Okay, so it's a transactional
They're not
type cost that we
penalizing
have to
us.
pay.
Yeah. They're not adding a cost to that. But the notion is we are in that pool with other people. If other people are coming into and out of that pool, we want them to pay the cost of doing that.
Yeah.
We don't want to pay that for them.
Right.
So similarly, when we're the ones
Because
leading the pool.
our decisions are causing the
Same
transaction
thing.
cost.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Pass through, basically, pass through cost to us
So.
Okay.
for the getting
Thank
out,
you.
getting in.
So all of this is, against the backdrop, this has gotten to be a much more interesting discussion of late as concerns have arisen, really across the country about whether or not managers are prioritizing factors, specifically those relating to ESG factors, in how they vote proxies. Just want you all to know we've been engaged for months and months with both State Street and BlackRock on this matter. And the way that we would like this to go, and this essentially came up earlier today, is we are very keen to not take any action that jeopardizes the significant economic benefits of the platforms that we have. And we do believe that we can separate this proxy voting question and address that. And that's a conversation that we're going to have later today. We have done more work than I thought possible on this. But let me pause and see if there are any questions, or Mark, if you have anything, I want to make sure you're.
No, obviously, I know we're going to talk about the proxies later, so I'll save my comments for that.
Okay. All right. So.
Just to be clear, we're talking about the solution aspect potentially.
Right.
In specific negotiations in regards to that, so that's why that'll come later in the meeting.
Right, okay. So I'll, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my comments.
All right, any more questions for Mr. Berg from his report? Hearing none and moving right along, I'll now recognize Mr. Brubaker and Mr. Potowski, both from Veris. And the floor is now yours, gentlemen.
Sorry, there we go, great. And I'm again, like Jeff said, I'm going to be brief. I know you have a long day, but we wanted to just set the table for something that we've talked about with you in the past. I think it kind of dovetails a lot with what Funston was talking about and some of the questions and discussions we had with Jeff earlier with respect to risk overall. And so I think, one of the things that we like to do with all of our clients at the beginning of a relationship, and then of course, on an ongoing basis, especially at times when we're doing an asset liability study going forward, is to do an enterprise risk tolerance overview. And, the main thing that we want to drive at, if you look at a risk tolerance of a commission like this, or a board, or any institutional asset owner, their ability to take on risk is really quantitative in nature. It's driven by the ability of the entity to make contributions and the certainty of those contributions. It's based on the funded status of the plan. Those are some of the things that would dictate the ability to take on risk. And that's on the horizontal axis of that exhibit on the right-hand side of the page. But then I think the main thing when we're talking about a board or the commissioners, it's one of the things that we want to do is help gauge your willingness to take on risk as well. And that's driven by a lot of different factors, and they're much more subjective in nature. It could be, just how much downside risk or illiquidity risk are you comfortable with as individuals and as a group? What's your goal in terms of closing your funded status gap through investment returns versus contributions? What are some of the what are the risk tolerances of some of the other stakeholders, the taxpayers, the legislature, et cetera? And so what we've done, and going on to this next slide, over the course of the next 2 months, we're hoping to have one-on-one conversations with each one of you to kind of walk you through this. We've created a questionnaire, and that enterprise risk tolerance survey that we've developed, it really covers 3 primary elements: governance, and again, a lot of that was touched on in the Funston presentation today. Objectives of the system itself, and then a comfort level with different asset classes within the portfolio as commissioners. You might find that some of you might be very comfortable and very familiar with hedge funds and private equity, while others are not as familiar. So in going through that survey with you and compiling the results, frankly, we're looking to really see where not only where your comfort level is, but where we need more education and where we should focus our time with respect to that. And so that's going to be conducted over the next 2 months. We're going to compile the results and present the findings to the board at the next meeting, or the commission at the next meeting. Again, we don't anticipate any asset allocation changes until, probably start on that late 24 with 2025 deliverable on that. But it's really just to get everybody's gauge on everybody's comfort level, everybody's understanding of different asset classes. It'll help us target education. And, when you think about the multitude of risks, we talk about risk as it's, a single point estimate. It's really not. There's all different elements of risk. There's volatility risk in the short term. There's drawdown risk. How much of a negative return are you willing to withstand in a short time period? There's illiquidity risk, as we've talked about. There's the risk of complexity. Building a portable alpha portfolio, for example, there are nuances and complexities to that introduce risk to the system. Inflation is a risk that was probably not at front and center in everyone's mind up until about 12 months ago. The risk of being different from your peers, which while it might not be a primary risk, it's something that you need to be aware of over time. And then I think maybe the biggest risk of all is falling short of your goals in the long term. You need to generate a return that's going to meet your return objectives over time. And in order to do that, you have to take some risk. And so anyways, this is part of the process. I just wanted to set the table. We're going to be working, with Mike and Jeff and with Tricia to get meetings set up with everybody to walk you through the questionnaire. And then I think it'll be really interesting when we get together to compile the results and present those at the next meeting. I think it'll be eye-opening to a lot of people. One of the things that we always see is I think different commissioners you might think a commissioner feels a certain way about risk or about a certain asset class, and you find out that they really are 180 degrees opposite from that. So we're looking forward to that. I think it's a really important part of the process, and I think it'll really help us get down the path on some of the objectives that Funston laid out with respect to risk, and it'll probably drive what kind of reporting you'll see going forward as well. And that's it. If any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
When you said that you're going to be contacting us in the next 2 months?
Yep.
Okay. So, all right. I got you.
Does that make sense? I mean, we can.
Those are
work.
one-on-one?
Those would be one-on-one type meethes. Yeah.
I would like to accelerate the timeline if it's practical.
Okay.
If you can, like I've said to Mike, if it's better, let's do it sooner.
Okay. Yeah.
You're very consistent.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll get working on it right away, getting them scheduled. I know the holiday season makes it difficult.
I understand. There's a lot of different things in the punch bowl right now. But,
right.
If this is part of the process, then let's get rolling.
Let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. We'll expedite it.
All right. Any questions for our consultants from Veris? Hearing none, we're just going to the delegated investment report, and again, I'm going to turn that over to our Chief Investment Officer, Mr. Berg.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This is the shortest ever delegated investment report. We closed one investment during the time between the last meeting and today. Is a value-add real estate strategy with the firm Equus Investment Partners. You all have been provided with the material relating to this investment, but that concludes the.
Yeah. But we will have a couple in the next week or so. Yeah, and then probably in the next week.
Okay.
So, right. So at least two. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Berg. I'm going to make a suggestion and just kind of get the tone of the commission here. Next up is executive session. It's also just a hair after noon. Has our lunch arrived yet?
Yes, sir.
I want to call for a motion to recede into executive session, and then we can eat while the presentations are going on there.
Perfect.
And then so kind of kill two birds with one stone and keep us as time efficient as we can. Can I have a motion to recede the executive session, please?
So moved.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion on receding into, on the motion to proceed into executive session?
And then, Mr. Chairman, the basis of that would be to discuss investment matters, including specific co-investments and private debt instruments pursuant to SC Code annotated sections 91680 and 916.320, to discuss personnel matters related to, pursuant to SC Code annotated section 30-4070A1, and to receive advice from our esteemed legal counsel pursuant to SC Code annotated section 30-4-70A2.
All right, our CEO has read the motion. We've had a motion and a second. I'm not hearing any discussions. I'll call for the vote. Everyone in favor of receding, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone object, please say no. We're now in executive session. We're back. All right, folks, we're back. Welcome back to open session. I've got the high sign that we're open. We're good? There's two points of business we need to take care of as a result of the deliberations that we had in executive session. I'm going to call on senior legal counsel to read the first motion that we're going to deliberate here in open session.
Sure. It's a motion that the commission, based on the outcome of the personnel discussion and performance review conducted in executive session, authorizes the compensation increase for Mr. Hitchcock as discussed in executive session and directs the CEO and other necessary parties to take all action to implement these decisions as approved by the commission, and directs that the salary increase will be disclosed to the public and in the minutes after the increase has been discussed with Mr. Hitchcock.
Could I have a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Missy left her proxy with us that she is an aye also, even though she's absent. So the ayes have it. The motion passes. The second issue to come out of executive session to be voted upon here in open session. Mr. CEO, would you please read that for us?
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to say that I'm deeply appreciative of the faith and confidence that the commission has shown and continues to show in me, and I will attempt to do my best to live up to that faith and confidence and doing all that I can to ensure that we are achieving our goals of managing the fund in a way that serves the interest of our beneficiaries. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, in regards to a motion, the motion would be to direct the CEO and CIO to take necessary action to engage a third-party proxy advisor to manage proxy votes in accordance with state law requirements. In that regard, by utilizing the BlackRock Voter Choice Program and through any other similar program offered by a passive equity provider when and if such program becomes available.
Should that and be an or? BlackRock or some other?
BlackRock, well, I was making it specific to the BlackRock Voter Choice Program and through any other similar program. If State Street offers a similar program, we'll utilize that program too.
Yeah.
We'll utilize whatever, but they don't have one right now, so.
Okay.
as
Yeah,
it-
okay. I just thought or was clear, but that's okay.
All right, so can I get a motion for what Mr. Hitchcock just read, please?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Let's put it to the vote. All in favor of the motion that Mr. Hitchcock just read, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. The motion carries. All right, folks, I think we've conducted all the business there is to conduct in this meeting today. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
I have a motion and a second. Do we want to discuss it?
Nope.
All in favor of adjourning? All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned.
Yeah,
Thank you,
there you
everyone.
go.
I was trying to hide